Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Callum Floume. This is my colleague, Gil Athoraya. We're employed at Optima Systems. Today we're here to talk to you about some of the collaborative work we've been doing on RIDE 4 and some of the future work we hope to do on RIDE 4.1. The objectives of this presentation is really to introduce you to the development team, review the new features that we've put out in RIDE 4.0, and if you're lucky, give an insight to the potential 4.1 developments, things we want to implement in the future. So the development team. First of all, we'd like to say thank you to all contributors. RIDE is an open source project, and various people have been talking about GitHub and open source technology. We're quite big advocates of it, and we welcome any contributions and pull requests that people want to make. We're quite active on GitHub, so if you raise issues, we'll see them and try and comment on them also. Thank you for all the bug reports. They bring us a lot of joy. No, really, it's good to get all the bug reports. We're trying to make RIDE a more useful tool every day, and squashing usability bugs really helps with this. We said goodbye to Nick late last year. I hope he's doing well, whatever he's doing. He moved RIDE along at quite a quick pace. We hope to carry on that pace. And this is the development team now, so we have myself and Gil, we're programmers. We're involved in developing the application, adding the new features in. And we have Mike Mingard, who's also an employee at Optima. He's our graphic designer. He's in charge of designing the new concepts and thinking of different ways things could be configured, displayed, colored, ultimately trying to get the best user experience. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Gil, and he's going to go through some of the new features we've implemented.
Right. So when Dyalog started talking about RIDE 4, they set up a few priorities that they thought would be good to work on. And you can see those listed here. I will go into more detail in the following slides. So upwards compatibility, making sure that RIDE 4 works with Dyalog version 15 as well as 16, and the other way around. So the previous version, RIDE 3, should be okay to connect to a Dyalog version 16 interpreter. And apart from minor glitches, that works in both directions quite well. So we're happy with that. Secure communications, if you're trying to connect to an interpreter on another machine without using a secure connection, you might be uncomfortable doing that because you're opening up yourself to anyone connecting to your interpreter. So we've added SSL with both a server certificate and a private client certificate, so you can add as much security as you want on a single end or both ends. And that works as well. Floating windows. Right, we're sorry to see the floating windows disappear from RIDE 4. We suffer as much as you are. We're aware of the issue. The support disappeared because of a change in the framework that we use for RIDE. So the RIDE 3 used a Node-Web.js framework, and it's been shifted to Electron, which is supporting more platforms, which is the main and principal reason to move to this other framework. Floating windows are supported in Electron. It's just a different framework, and at the time that the project was undertaken, that support wasn't as strong as it is today. So this is something that we will revisit. Right, so with the Electron framework, we can now support RIDE on Raspberry Pi. It works on Pi's version 2 and 3. The version 1 and 0 use a different chipset, which is not supported by Electron itself, and therefore we don't see any plans on supporting those platforms or those versions of Raspberry Pi. The zero footprint operation is a mode that you can run a RIDE client without installing any application on your local machine. So what it means in practice is that the interpreter acts as a server, and it serves the RIDE client through a web server built into the interpreter. In practice, that means you could use your laptop or tablet even to connect to a running interpreter through your standard internet browser, which of course would be convenient. Maybe not so useful on a mobile phone, but in theory should work even on that. And that should also support TLS and secure connections. I should add that this is still under development, but it is working in a working state, so it's not fully supported yet. In addition to SSL connections for secure communications, there's also an option to connect through SSH and an SSH tunnel. With RIDE, you can connect to a running interpreter through SSH. You can also connect to a machine and start an interpreter and then carry on the communications through this secure tunnel. And that's also in RIDE 4 working. Workspace Explorer was something that was missing in version 3. It's been added back in. It looks more or less like the Windows IDE version. It's got a tree structure of the content of your workspace, and it, if opened, is on the left-hand side of RIDE. And in addition to the Workspace Explorer, we have a second panel, the debug panel, which contains two sections, one for the running threads and one for a stack. So in the thread window, you can switch threads or see which threads are running, just like you do with the wide. And for the stack, it lists the current stack, function stack, when you're interrupting execution or tracing. And right, another important aspect of RIDE 4 was the user experience, trying to improve the user experience. And as you're all aware, RIDE has gone through a few iterations now from more or less a prototype to, we like to say, the first proper version of RIDE. So we're still focusing on the user experience. We want it to be as slick and comfortable to use as the wide version. But it's something we're still working on, and Callum will show you later a few of the latest ideas for the next version. We've added a search feature which allows you to search the session log using standard text search or regex, and similarly a replace feature using the same mechanism. And you can search the editor and tracer as well. So it's the same search feature, search functionality in both. As Morten banged on before about source code management, one aspect of source code management is that the code doesn't change unless you change it. And an issue with RIDE previously was that the RIDE client would use its own rules for indentation and formatting of the code. With RIDE 4, there's now an option to ask the interpreter to deal with that. So whenever you edit a function, the content is sent off to the interpreter, so all the indentation is done on that side, which means that it will be consistent between users that are working on the code from RIDE or from wide directly in the old user interface. Right, to summarize, of all the lists of priorities, we've done about 72%. Great success. And as you can see, there's a couple of things that we're still working on to finalize and for the next version. And then there's the one red point there that people may agree with me on that we would like to prioritize for the next version. Over to you, Cal.
Thank you. So just to reiterate on what Gil said, there's a couple of points that are real bugbears in the RIDE users community. One of those being floating windows. It is something that's being actively explored as we speak. And we're hoping to see support reappear for that in RIDE 4.1. So, yeah. Zero footprint operation, Gil also mentioned earlier. It is out there, it is available. We're still working on squashing some of the usability bugs and making sure that it's fully operational for day-to-day use. It's getting better, and it should be production ready soon. User experience is an ongoing development. Mike Mingard's been working really hard on getting some concepts through. It's finding the balance which doesn't scare off the old users and attracts the new users also. It's quite a fine balance in that, and we want to find something that works for everyone. Usability bug fixing remains high on our list. We do monitor GitHub quite regularly and try and squash the major usability bugs as quickly as we can. We understand it's annoying sometimes when you want to use RIDE. Sometimes you have no option, and a bug is preventing you. So we're hot on that. Finally, the optimization of editing and tracing large scripts. Again, we're very aware this is an issue. We're working on it as much as we can. We aim to have a resolution fairly soon, and that will also come out with RIDE 4.1.
Our recommendation is you use denotative function styling and just occupy 5 to 10 lines of code on your scripts. Will work.
So those is a quick insight for RIDE 4.1. And now we're just going to give a quick demo of the new features. And there is no right bracket demo function for this, so excuse any mistakes.
Right, so if we start with the connect page here, the secure connections are offered in 2 flavors. So if you want to connect over SSH, you check that box and you fill in your details, pick the way of authenticating, if it's a password or a key file, and off you go. The other option is to use SSL, in which case similarly you either provide a user certificate or you rely on the server certificate only. So there's a few options there. And finally, to connect and start an interpreter, it's very similar. You just fill in the extra details required to pass parameters to the interpreter. In addition to, I guess if you click that again, you get a list of available interpreters on the remote machine by hitting the button there. It will then interrogate the machine and return a list of available versions that you can start. Right, if we start a local interpreter, we can take a look at the new features. So Callum has just hidden the 2 new panels.
They weren't supposed
quickly.
to be visible.
But I guess we can start with those then. So from the view menu, you select the Show Workspace Explorer and it pops up on the left. If you copy in a workspace, you get some content in there. You can navigate that just as you would expect. And as you can see, the different types of objects have different icons with different colors, so they stand out a little bit. And the second panel, Show Debug. And we get the debug pane here. So on the top, you've got a threads part, and the bottom part is the function stack. And what Callum will do now is start a few threads just to demonstrate that the thread window is populated. So we'll have the typical delay function, and as you can see, it's appearing in the threads window. You need to manually poll it to refresh just to make it more efficient. So unless you're interested in the current status, it will just show whatever the state was of the threads when it was last refreshed, as it were. The second one we're going to demonstrate is the stack. So the function stack, if you've got trace on error, will appear on that error there, and on the right you can see the stack indicating the current function and, well, all the functions that are on the stack. These windows will remain on screen between sessions, or it will remember the state of the panes between sessions. So if you like them and you keep them open, when you restart RIDE, it will reopen them for you. If you prefer not to see them, then closing them down before you close RIDE, and it will start out with a fresh, open, clear workspace. Right. Another feature we wanted to demonstrate was the interpreter level formatting. So Callum is pretending to code in APL, and as you can see, it's just right. He's now showing where to configure that. So in the settings, in the preferences, there's a checkbox to handle formatting through the interpreter, and in addition to that, there's a shortcut, a keyboard shortcut that you can set up, which he has set to Control-Alt-R. And if he executes that keyboard shortcut, you see a slight jump, and that's the interpreter kicking in and formatting the code for you. If we try the search, which is another keyboard shortcut, Callum will tell you what it is. Is it fixed or is it configurable?
Control-F, sorry. Control-F for search and Control-H for search and replace. They're just the defaults, but you can obviously change them through the configuration.
Right. And as you can see, there's support for regex there, so you search that and it tells you where in the session those expressions were. Okay. And the same keyboard shortcut works in the editor as well. So, right. Was there anything left?
No, I think that's it for the new features.
That covers the new features in RIDE more or less.
I'm just going to take you through a couple of the concepts that Mike designed for us. These are nothing final, so don't get upset or over-delighted about them. So I said earlier, it's a very fine line between appeasing the old users and attracting the new users. So we're just playing around with things like new icons and the layout of the windows. At the moment, RIDE's quite dynamic, so you can drag the windows about and get different tabs, alternate, which is a fairly familiar idea with the ODE. But stuff like icons are quite embedded in the minds of APLers by now, so they know what they do. We're careful to change those. So again, we have another concept in a different color. Color's playing quite a big role in the design also. Here's a concept for the Workspace Explorer. We'd like to get people's feedback on what they think of it. Obviously, RIDE 4 it was introduced. We need to know what people think of it, whether they like the color scheme, whether they like the layout, the performance of it, etc. The more feedback we get, the more we can refine it to people's needs. And this is kind of how we're working in the graphic design area. So Mike will come up with a color palette with a few hex values, and we'll try and implement this in the design, see if it works or not, see if people like it, and then we'll move on and try another palette. Maybe it's not suitable, maybe it's a bit too garish. And the aim is to also produce syntax highlighting themes to go with these color schemes also. And another big bugbear of RIDE users at the moment is the connect page. It's a bit awful. So the ultimate aim is to try and configure it so it's a more usable layout. Things are more evident, such as how you start connections, the type of connection that you want to start, things like the password or key file. Things look a bit more uniform and a bit more tidy. So that's coming very soon. The connect page stuff is actually already pretty much all the way through. So I guess that's all. Thank you very much for listening, and we'd welcome any questions.
You mentioned briefly that the default bindings for search and replace is Control F and Control H.
Sorry, Control G I meant.
Just Control G and Control F.
Yeah.
Doesn't that clash with the normal keyboarding for APL symbols?
It does, yeah, but the backtick operation often provides an escape. You can always rebind the keys to more preferable combinations, such as Control-Alt-R, which doesn't clash with anything on your computer. We understand that sometimes there may be clashes, but that's why we provide the configurability to change them.
I think Adam meant the clashing with the APL characters, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Our users tend to use the tick. But yes, I think this is a fully configurable keyboard shortcut. We might change the keyboard the default keyboard shortcut if the consensus is that we should keep them off the APL keyboard. I don't know. Is it important?
I miss in RIDE 4, in all versions of RIDE, the current object that appears in the Windows.
The status window, as in the status line.
Yes, that is very useful in user commands. And I also miss the fact I've got no way of hooking in user commands and modifying these screens to have extra menu items that I want. So
right.
That's something to think about in the future.
Thank you.
We'll give it some thought.
These are just two observations. First of all, thank you. That's the really big thing. It's made my life a lot easier. It gets nicer with every release. That's terrific. One thing you may already have answered this. If I'm at the moment, if I resize my edit window, it forgets and goes back to the previous size. So is that something that you might... well, I'm really only interested when you get floating edit windows. Can I urge you that it kind of remembers my preferred size?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the current situation with the editor. You share the space with a session, right?
Yeah.
So, and the RIDE remembers the panel sizes for the Workspace Explorer and the debug. So if you resize those, it remembers that. The rest of the space is shared with a session. So it might get difficult to... With the current non-floating Windows version, we might struggle to get that working.
Yeah, I'll reserve comments until we have floating edit windows. Great. And the other thing is that maybe if people hadn't seen this, on the Mac, I use a small 13-inch Mac for my APL development. My eyes are not as good as they used to be, so I tend to run a session width of maybe 100 characters to get a big enough font to read, and that's the whole screen. And so for me, this screen real estate is a big thing. Yep. But it's lovely. And the final thing is, just as a request, if you can make. I find it disruptive to have to switch from the keyboard to the mouse and back for simple repetitive stuff. So at the moment, if I start the editor, I have to drag the border across most of the screen to see 80 columns of thing. I'm hoping that when we have floating edit windows, it'll just come up the size I like, and that'll be good. Otherwise, I kind of like a shortcut key to do that.
Yeah. Do you typically have the Workspace Explorer and debug pane open?
Say again?
Do you typically have the Workspace Explorer and debug pane open at the same time?
No, I tend not to. Very kind of Zen style.
In which case, you'd get half of the space available. So we'd have to wait till floating point floating windows. Floating point would be interesting as well. Yeah, I share your sympathies because I've got an 11-inch MacBook when I try RIDE, so I have even less.
So with 100 quad PW of 100, my edit window opens 50 columns wide, which is just not quite enough for me.
Right cursor functions.
Need a few more, But sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm keen to know how many people have actually used the RIDE. Quite clear. Is that just tested it? Or how many people are using it for real work? Mostly internals.
Nice.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
It's looking great.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.